Okay, let's dive into this. Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're taking a look at what has rapidly become the absolute highest stakes technology lawsuit on the planet. I'm talking about the massive, incredibly complex legal battle between the New York Times and OpenAI. And look, this isn't just some standard corporate drama. This is literally a foundational dispute about the future of information itself. To really wrap our heads around what's happening here, just think about this for a second. Let's say I wrote a book, and you photocopied the entire thing, right? And then you started selling your own books based on exactly what you learned from mine without paying me a single cent. We'd all probably agree that's theft, right? It's a pretty clear-cut, everyday concept of intellectual property and basic fairness. Now, let's move to this next slide and see how this builds. What if, instead of just one single book, we're talking about millions of articles, decades of hardcore investigative journalism and reporting? And instead of a person doing that photocopying, what if it was the most powerful artificial intelligence system ever built? Guys, that's not a hypothetical. That is exactly what the New York Times says OpenAI did to train ChatGPT. And it's the beating heart of this entire legal showdown. And just to show you exactly how serious this is, take a look at this massive number, $28 million. That's a staggering amount the New York Times has already spent on legal fees fighting this battle, just as of July 2026. I mean, nearly $5 million of that was spent in the first half of the year alone. To put that into perspective, that is way more money than many newspapers make in an entire year. So the fact that the Times is willing to burn through that much cash tells you everything you need to know about how high the stakes actually are here. So let's look at part one, timeline of the lawsuit, and how we actually got to July 2026. To really understand this conflict, we have to trace the facts. It all kicked off in late 2023. That's when the New York Times officially sued OpenAI and Microsoft, claiming massive copyright infringement, arguing they used millions of their articles without permission or payment. Then, moving into 2024 and 2025, we hit the discovery phase. And well, this is where things got really messy. The Times started accusing OpenAI of stonewalling and hiding evidence about its training data, and that brings us right to July 2026. The conflict just escalated dramatically over these hidden evidence claims, and other big publishers, specifically the Daily News and the Center for Investigative Reporting, actually jumped into the fray. So the scope of the battle just keeps expanding as those massive legal fees pile up. Moving on to part two, arguments. NYT versus OpenAI, two very different visions of the digital economy. And honestly, both sides actually make really valid points here, so we need to look at this totally impartially. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how it humanizes the publisher's perspective. Think about the sheer cost and human effort it takes to produce quality journalism. You're spending millions sending reporters to actual war zones, investigating deep corruption, covering local elections. You have to pay editors, fact-checkers. It takes literally thousands of hours. And then a tech company just comes along, feeds all of that blood, sweat, and tears into a machine without asking permission, and builds a product that can answer people's questions so they never even have to visit your website. For the Times, this isn't just an annoyance, it threatens the very survival of their business. But, if we flip the viewpoint, the tech perspective is honestly equally compelling. OpenAI argues they absolutely didn't steal anything. Think about it. When a human reporter reads 100 articles to learn about a topic and then writes their own piece, we don't call that theft, right? We call it research. OpenAI says AI training is the exact same thing, just done at an unprecedented scale. Their stance is that their model doesn't store exact copies of these articles in a database somewhere. Instead, it's learning patterns, facts, and language structures, really similar to how a human mind works. And this brilliantly illustrates these two contrasting philosophies sitting side by side. On the left, the Times basically sees AI as this massive copying machine that threatens to completely destroy the news business. While on the right, OpenAI sees AI as a learning machine, just doing legitimate research on publicly available text. Actually, a really important side note here, OpenAI has already successfully made licensing deals with other major publishers, like the Associated Press and Axel Springer, but they found the New York Times' specific financial demands to be, in their words, completely unreasonable. All right, part three, understanding fair use, demystifying the law.
So, the legal mechanism that's actually going to decide the winner of this entire dispute is this concept of fair use. It's a legal doctrine in U.S. copyright law that allows the limited use of copyrighted material without permission for things like research, criticism, or teaching. To give you a practical, everyday example of this, it's the exact same doctrine that lets a book reviewer quote a paragraph from a brand new novel in their review without getting sued into oblivion by the author.
When courts try to figure out if something actually qualifies as fair use, they don't just guess. They look at 4 specific factors. First up is purpose. Is the new use transformative? Like, does it add something completely new to the table? Second is nature. Is the original work mostly factual, like a news report, or is it highly creative, like a sci-fi novel? Factual works usually get a bit less protection. Third is amount. Did they just use a tiny little paragraph, or did they take the whole entire book? And fourth is market effect. Does this new creation hurt the market or the sales of the original work? So the crucial point is where the battle lines are actually drawn here. OpenAI hangs its hat really heavily on that first factor. They argue their AI training is highly transformative. They aren't just reproducing articles, they're creating a totally brand new tool. The Times, on the other hand, builds its case almost entirely around the fourth factor, market effect. They're arguing that ChatGPT directly competes with them and replaces the need for users to ever actually visit news sites, which completely destroys their market. Which brings us to part 4. What is at stake beyond the courtroom? Now, you might be sitting there thinking, okay, why does this billionaire corporate fight actually matter to me? Well, first off, it dictates the entire future of journalism. If AI replaces news sites, the economic foundation of reporting completely collapses. Real, hard-hitting investigative reporting costs money. It requires salaries, travel, heavy legal protection, and there's a direct, undeniable relationship between a free press and a functioning democracy. Without funded journalism, corruption thrives. It's really that simple. Second, this huge dispute affects the future of the open internet. Like, will only the richest companies be able to afford to build AI models? Because if the New York Times wins, it could mean mandatory licensing for all training data. And sure, while that sounds totally fair to creators, it would make AI development unbelievably expensive. It could lock out smaller startups, academic researchers, and open source projects, essentially concentrating all the power of AI exclusively into the hands of a few super wealthy tech giants. Third, it challenges the future of creative work as a whole. And guys, this goes way beyond just journalists. We're talking about all creators, writers, musicians, photographers, filmmakers. What actually happens to the economic value of human creativity? Why spend years mastering a craft if a machine can instantly ingest everything you've ever made and just do your job for free? Literally, every creative professional on Earth is watching this case super closely. Let's dive into part 5. 4 possible future outcomes. Where do we go from here? Because the Supreme Court has never actually ruled on this, whatever happens next is going to set a massive, multi-decade precedent for all of us. Let's look at the 4 ways this could shake out. Scenario 1, OpenAI wins. The courts decide AI training is indeed fair use. This would basically be a business-as-usual outcome for the tech industry, preserving a wide-open path for AI development. But on the flip side, it would dramatically deepen the immediate crisis for publishers, ultimately forcing them to invent entirely new business models just to survive in an AI-driven world. Then there's scenario 2, the Times wins, meaning AI training legally requires paid licensing. This would completely reshape tech economics overnight. Training data would basically become a paid meter utility, kind of like electricity or internet bandwidth. And while this messy transition would finally financially benefit creators and publishers, like we touched on earlier, it would heavily concentrate AI power among only the wealthiest tech giants who can actually afford to foot the bill. Scenario 3 is a settlement. The companies strike a licensing deal before a verdict is ever even reached. And honestly, this is probably the most likely outcome. Most mega lawsuits settle before trial anyway. And OpenAI has already shown they're willing to pay publishers. If they do settle, the specific terms of that agreement would instantly create a massive financial template for the entire global AI industry to follow. Finally, scenario 4, Congress steps in. Lawmakers could just decide the courts aren't the right place to solve this and instead create a compulsory licensing system. Think about how radio stations pay to play music. They don't negotiate with every single artist individually, right? The rates are just set by law. A similar system could be built from the ground up for AI training data, completely bypassing these messy private negotiations altogether. So ultimately, we're left with this massive question. In the age of artificial intelligence, who owns human knowledge? Is everything ever published on the internet just free raw material for machines? Or do human creators deserve a real share of the trillion-dollar industry that's being built on the back of their work? We are definitely going to find out. But, if you believe human content truly matters, the absolute best thing you can do right now is support the journalism and the creators that you value. Pay for the reporting you rely on, because the strongest argument that AI should pay for content is proving that human creativity has value in the very first place. Thank you so much for exploring this explainer with me. I'll catch you next time.